Did you know that the crucial first step the pros take when creating their reports is to create a calendar table, as it is essential for dealing with time-related data and it's best practice? I'm going to show you 4 easy ways to create your calendar tables in Power Query, Power Pivot, and a fiscal year calendar in Power BI. We have our sales data query, and it has a column of dates called Date. These are the dates on which our sales were made. Let's create a blank query, and here in our formula bar, let's type equals sales data, and in square brackets, let's type date, which is the column that we want from our sales data table. And remember, columns are always in square brackets in Power Query. And hit enter, and we get the dates from our sales data table in a list format. We're going to use this list to create our calendar table. Let's remove the duplicates, as our calendar cannot have duplicates. Now we need to use the date function here in the Add Column tab, but it's grayed out. And the same with the functions in the Transform tab. That's because this query is in a list format. So let's go back to the List Tools Transform tab and click Convert to Table. We can leave everything here as the default and click OK. And our list is now in a table format. Let's go back to the Add Column tab and click on Date, Year, and click Year. And let's do the same for Month and click on Month. And we get the month number, and this time let's get the month name. Remember to select your date column each time. Let's rename this column to Date and call this query Calendar Table. And let's change our data type to Date for our date column. Next, let's send this to Excel. We're going to use Close and Load To, as we want to send this to the data model. Let's select Only Create Connection and check Add this data to the data model, and click OK. Next, let's click on this tab called Power Pivot. This is where our table's loaded to when we selected Load to Data Model. If you don't have the Power Pivot tab, right-click anywhere on your ribbon and click Customize the ribbon. And here under Choose Commands From, let's click on the drop-down as it currently shows popular commands. And let's select All Tabs. And here under Main Tabs, we have Power Pivot. Select that and click on Add. And it will get added here to the right under Main Tabs. And click OK. So let's click on Power Pivot and click on Manage. And we're taken to our Power Pivot window. And we can see our sales data table and calendar table that we loaded from Power Query. If this is your first time seeing Power Pivot, what this tool does is it allows us to build relationships between tables of related data, which is known as data modeling. And when these tables are connected, they can all be used together in pivot tables to slice and dice our data. To create our models, let's click on the Diagram View tab, and we have our sales data table, which has our sales transactions, and we have our calendar table that we created in Power Query. Let's click on Date in our calendar table and drag it down to Date in our sales data table, and we've created our relationship, which is a one-to-many relationship. Our calendar is the one side of the relationship, as we have unique dates in our calendar table. Remember, we removed duplicate dates when we created our calendar in Power Query, so it's the one side. And our sales data table is the many side, as there can be many sales transactions on the same date. Let's close our Power Pivot window, and let's click on Insert, and click on the Pivot Table drop-down, and click From Data Model, and we want it in a new worksheet, and click OK. We get our Pivot Table Fields pane here on the right. These are the tables that we loaded to our data model from Power Query, and the bottom table is our original source data. To create our pivot table, we will only use our data model tables. Let's click on our sales data table and drag product name to rows, and drag sales value to the values area. I also want to see the margin. Next, let's click on our calendar table and right-click on Year and click Add as Slicer. and we get our year slicer. You can format your slicer, as when you click on it, the slicer tab appears. Let's change this to 3 columns and click on Slicer Settings and uncheck Display Header and click OK, as we can see that these are our years. Now to get back our pivot table fields pane on the right here, we need to click on our pivot table. Let's go to our calendar table and right-click on month name and click Add as Slicer. And we have our month slicer. But our months are not in the correct order. This is really easy to fix. Let's go back to our Power Pivot tab and click on Manage, and let's go to our calendar table and select our month name column, and at the top here we have Sort by Column. So let's click that. The column that we want to sort is our month name column, and we want to sort by our month column, as this is where our month numbers are, and click OK. Let's go back to our pivot table, and our month names are now in the correct order. So we can now slice and dice our data and analyze however we please. You can also add charts for visual analysis. We have our sales data query here in our query editor. To create our calendar table in Power Pivot, let's click Close and Load To, and we want to only create a connection. And we also want to load our table to the data model. Next, let's go to the Power Pivot tab, click on Manage, and our Power Pivot window opens up. Let's go to the Design tab, and let's click on Date Table, and click on New. And Power Pivot has automatically generated our calendar table. These dates are generated from our sales data table that we loaded to the data model. And it's created quite a few different date formats like month, year, day of week number, and day of week. Let's say we wanted our date as a short month and year, so let's name this column MMMYY. Then in the formula bar after the equal sign, type format, and in brackets, type date. And let's select calendar date, as we want the date column from our calendar table, comma, and in double quotations, type MMM and the ampersand sign, and in double quotations, type the apostrophe YY, and close your brackets and hit enter. And we have our custom date format. And let's go to Home and click on our diagram view. And let's drag and drop date from our calendar table to our sales data table. And we've created a one-to-many relationship. And let's close this window. And let's go to Insert and create our pivot table from the data model. We want to see our product name by sales value and by margin. And we want to slice and dice by year and month. Power Pivot automatically sorted our months for us, so we don't need to do anything further. And we can see our additional time periods that Power Pivot created, if you want to use those in your slices. And we also have our custom date that we created. Now let's say that we have 2 source data tables and both have multiple date columns. So here in our sales order table, we have order date that starts on 7th January 2020 and payment date that starts on 9th Feb 2020. And our shipping table has shipping date that starts on 8th January and our billing date starts on 9th January. So we have lots of different start dates. This is where a calendar table will help us, as we can use it to connect these 2 tables. And it will also have a unique set of continuous dates that we can use, as these source tables only have dates on which transactions were made. So some dates are missing. Let's create a blank query. And here in our formula bar, let's type equals and insert the curly brackets, as we want a list of dates. And lists are always in curly brackets in Power Query. And type hash date, and in brackets, type our start date. And let's type ... as this is the to operator, and type hash date, and let's type our end date. This covers the time period that is across our source tables. And hit enter, and we get this error. We cannot apply operator to types date and date. So the to operator works with numbers. So inside our first curly bracket, let's use the number.from function and insert the open and close brackets around our first date and type number.from after our to operator. Insert the open and close brackets around our second date and hit enter, and we get these list of numbers. Let's convert them to a table, and we can keep everything as the default and click OK. Let's change this to a date format, and we now have our list of dates. Let's add our year, month name, and month columns, and rename this column to date. And let's rename this query to calendar table. And let's close and load to. We want to only create a connection and add this to the data model. Let's go to our data model, and for the calendar table, let's sort our month name by month so that our months are in the correct order when we create our slices. Next, let's click on the diagram view, and we have our calendar table, sales order table, and shipping table. Let's create our relationships using date in our calendar table and drag it to order date in our sales order table and shipping date in our shipping table. And we've created our one-to-many relationships. Next, let's create our pivot table from our data model. In our sales order table, let's see our product range and the sales values and gross profit. And let's create another pivot table, and we're going to use our shipping table. Let's use our product range and cost of sales. Next, let's click on our calendar table and right-click on month name and click Add a Slicer. And let's also add a year slicer. When we click on our slices, they only filter our second pivot table. Let's right-click on our month slicer and go to Report Connections and check our first pivot table so that our slicer can also connect to our sales order table, and click OK. So now when we select our months, both our pivot tables are filtered for that time period. We can do the same for our year filter so that both tables are filtered by our year slicer as well. To create our calendar table in Power BI, let's go to the Data View tab, and we can see that we already have our data imported into Power BI. Let's click on Table Tools, click on New Table, and here in our formula bar, let's call this Calendar Table equals and type Calendar. And we want Calendar Auto, so let's select it from our IntelliSense. This function returns a single column of dates that are automatically generated from all the dates in our model. Let's insert a closed bracket and hit enter, and we have our dates. Next, let's add a new column to our table, and let's call this new column year equals and type the year function. This function requires a date as the input. Our date is here in the column called date. So let's type that column name, and the IntelliSense brings up the date function, but we need the date column and not the function. It's here in the calendar table with the date column in square brackets. So let's select that and hit enter, and we have all our years. Let's add a new column and call this month equals, and we're going to use the format function. This function allows you to control the appearance of your data based on your desired format. Our first parameter will be our value, which is our dates in the date column from our calendar table. Insert a comma, and the format that we want is the full month name, which is shown by the 4 M's in double quotation marks. And let's insert the close bracket and hit enter, and we get our full month names. Now, if we remove one of the M's and hit enter, we have our month names shortened. Next, let's add a new column and call it month number. equals, and we're going to use the month function, and our parameter is the date column in our calendar table, and insert the close bracket and hit enter, and we have our month numbers. Next, let's add our quarters. Equals, quarter, and our parameter is the date column in our calendar table. Insert the close bracket and hit enter, and we have our quarters for the period. In our formula bar, let's type Q after the equal sign and insert the double quotations and insert the ampersand sign and hit enter, and we get our quarters in this format. Let's add a new column and let's call it DDMMYY, as I also want my date in the format of day, month, year, and we're going to use the format function for that. And our input will be our date column from our calendar table. Insert a comma and in double quotations DDMMYYYY and hit enter, and we get our date in this format. This calendar table is based on our fiscal period starting in January, but let's say our fiscal year started in October, so we would want Q1 to start in October and not January. All we need to do is go back to our date column that we created, and in the brackets of our calendar auto function, insert a 9, as our fiscal year ends in September, which is month 9, and hit enter, and our calendar table updates to show October as our first month in our fiscal period. So when we're using calendar auto, always add the last month of the fiscal period as your parameter. If we don't, it defaults to December being our last month, and our calendar will start with January. But this hasn't updated our month number or quarter, as it still shows October as month 10, and that's in Q4. We want October to be month 1 and Q1. No problem. Let's add a new column and call it fiscal quarter equals, and let's type eDate. This requires 2 arguments, the start date, which is basically the dates in our date column, which is here in our calendar table. So let's select that, comma, and the second argument is the number of months from the start date. Let's use 1 for now, so you can see how this function works. The month that it returns is November, as this is 1 month away from October. And if we scroll down to November, December is returned as it's 1 month away from November. If we change this to 2, then it correctly returns December, as it's 2 months away from October. And if we look at January as another check, March is returned as it's 2 months away from January. So this is how eDate works. So 2 months from October is December, and December by default is in quarter 4. Now, if we wrap this in the quarter function, it now returns quarter 4, which December falls in by default. So what we need to do is return January with our eDate function, as January is in Q1 by default. So how do we do that? Well, January is 9 months away from October. And remember, October is the start of our fiscal period in this example. So let's replace the 2 with -9 and hit enter, and Q1 is returned, which is the correct fiscal quarter that October falls in. Let's scroll down to September so we can perform a quick check, and it correctly shows as quarter 4, as it's the last quarter of our fiscal period. Let's add Q in double quotation marks after the equal sign and the ampersand sign, and hit enter, so that we have the Q for quarter. Now let's copy this code and add a new column and paste it here. Let's call it fiscal month and remove the Q and ampersand sign, and let's replace quarter with month and hit enter. And we have October showing as the first month in our fiscal period. Let's perform a quick check on March, and it correctly shows as month 6 in our fiscal period. So the month function works in a similar way to the quarter function, as it defaults to our calendar period being January to December, and all we need to do is a bit of simple math using the eDate function to return the fiscal periods that we require. So now we have our calendar table. You can always add more columns if you need them. Now, if we expand our date column here in our calendar table, we have these automatic date hierarchies. So every time that there is a date column in Power BI, it automatically creates these hierarchies. And if we check our sales data table and expand our date column, there's the automatic date hierarchy. Now, as we've created our own calendar table, we don't need this automatic date and time setting, so let's disable it. Click on File, Options and Settings, Options, and under Current File, click on Data Load, and here under Time Intelligence, uncheck Auto Date Time and click OK. And now if we check our date columns, the automatic hierarchy has disappeared from both our tables. Next, ensure you're in your calendar table, and under Table Tools, click on Mark as Date Table. This dialog box pops up, and here's where we need to select the column to be used as the date. And notice that the column has to be a date type with unique values. Our date column in our calendar table has that. So let's select it from the drop-down and click OK. And we get this icon next to our date column, which means that it has now been identified as a date column in an actual date table. Marking your date table as a date table is best practice, as it helps with your time intelligence functions. Now, if you've been dabbling in a bit of DAX, and you find that your formula grays out whenever you use certain functions, like sum in Power BI, or you would like to understand the difference between sum and SUMX, as well as understand calculated columns and measures, then I highly recommend you watch this video here. It gives you a great introduction to DAX, and it will help you build your foundation to understanding this very powerful language.